Okay, welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take your sources, your questions, and really just dig in deep to understand what's actually going on.
That's right.
And today we're doing one specifically for you, looking at some, well, pretty intense recent events down in Los Angeles, all tied to ICE activity.
And we've got a really interesting mix of sources to work with here. First up, there's this report, like straight from the streets of LA. It's immediate, you know. You hear the voices of people who are right in the middle of it.
Yeah, that one you can almost feel the energy like coming off the page. It's really something.
Definitely.
And then we're also folding in insights from a conversation you shared with us. That gives us some really crucial historical background.
Yeah, and it connects these current events to some deeper ongoing stuff,
Yeah.
especially hitting on your questions about history, identity, and even your own personal run-ins with law enforcement.
Exactly. So our mission today, it's really to get past the headlines. We want to unpack the complexity of what's happening on the ground in LA right now
Uh-huh. Look at the different viewpoints, from people involved.
and tie all back to the bigger historical picture and why it matters to you personally based on those things you're interested in.
Right. Let's get into it.
Okay, so let's dive right into the scene itself. Downtown LA. What kicked this whole thing off? Our source mentions these ICE raids, specifically targeting job sites.
Yeah, that seems to be the catalyst. Think Home Depot parking lots, businesses in the fashion district, places where migrant workers, day laborers are known to gather.
Right? Common spots.
And according to this report, things escalated fast. Like on that Friday, people started confronting the federal agents right there on the street.
Wow.
And apparently it got tense enough that they used tear gas to try and break things up.
So immediate conflict.
Yeah.
And it didn't just end there. The next day, things moved.
Moved to City Hall, yeah.
Yeah.
And it turned into this huge show of support. Thousands of people, the report says, gathered to stand with, their undocumented neighbors, their communities. It was a big turnout.
And you mentioned law enforcement was out in big numbers, too. Who exactly was there?
Well, the report lists quite a few. You had LAPD, ICE agents themselves, California Highway Patrol, DHS, even the FBI showed up. So yeah, a lot of different uniforms.
And the interactions described sound pretty intense. Blocking marches, using force.
Yeah, the report mentions gas, rubber bullets, and notes that some of those rubber bullets were fired, like rapidly and at close range, which, sounds incredibly dangerous.
Definitely.
And there's this really jarring quote in there, too. Some protesters felt they were being treated like dogs, and there's a phrase about police begging niggas with sticks. It really hits home, that feeling of being dehumanized that people were describing.
Yeah, that's rough. And while all this is happening locally, there's national news breaking too, like President Trump ordering troops.
Right. The report mentions an order for 2,000 National Guard troops heading to L.A., plus about 700 Marines already tasked.
Oh.
That immediately signals this tension, right, between the state and the federal government.
Absolutely. Because California officials like Karen Bass, they weren't asking for this, were they?
No, seemed pretty clear they felt this federal push wasn't needed, wasn't helpful. So you had this kind of standoff brewing between D.C. and California's take on the situation.
And the source pointed out something kind of ironic, an executive order about arresting people wearing masks.
Yeah, while the ICE agents themselves were apparently wearing masks. A bit of a contradiction noted there.
Hmm.
But, the real power of this report, I think, comes from the voices, the people actually there on the street. That's where it gets really personal.
Like that young man, only 15, first-generation American, identifies as Mexican first, American second. What was his take?
He felt like he was being targeted. You could just, feel his fear for his mother, who came from Mexico, and just this raw anger towards IC, towards the administration. That's a powerful voice, from the next generation.
It really is. And then you hear from a Marine veteran calling it all bullshit.
Yeah, his view was that the authorities were protecting their own interests, basically, not the people. So they're just locking up innocent immigrants trying to provide for their families. It's an interesting perspective coming from someone with military experience questioning the operation.
And there's this whole angle about rights, too, right? If you're born here, you get due process. How did that square with what ICE was reportedly doing?
Well, it highlights that clash, doesn't it? The report mentioned a stated ICE goal of arresting 3,000 illegal migrants a day. I mean, that kind of mass arrest focus runs right up against the idea of individual rights, due process, even for non-citizens on U.S. soil sometimes.
Yeah, it's a fundamental conflict.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned voices celebrating the culture, tacos, elotes.
Yeah, it's like a counter-narrative, asking why target people who bring this cultural richness. And emphasizing that shared humanity, we bleed the same, it kind of brings it back down to basics.
The immigration attorney's perspective, Jesse Blancarda, seems really key to understanding who is being targeted. What did he say?
He was really clear. He said these raids weren't about gang members, like maybe some narratives suggest. They were hitting day laborers, factory workers, essential workers, people who are part of the community fabric, families.
People are just trying to make a living.
Exactly. And he described people being taken from job sites or even when they went for routine ICE check-ins. And they weren't coming back out.
Really?
It underscored that this crackdown was hitting, like, ordinary people just trying to get by.
And that woman's voice, feeling like showing her face was dangerous, but she had to. Her line, "Nobody is illegal on stolen land," that's powerful.
Oh, absolutely. It connects directly to history, right?
Yeah.
Saying the land belongs to the Gabriello tribe, that the border crossed us. It reframes the whole thing and paints L.A. as this, united melting pot that's going to stand together.
And finally, that man, undocumented for 27 years, his story just highlights how incredibly difficult the legal system is.
It really does. I mean, he had an American mother, and it still took him decades to sort out his citizenship. And now, as a citizen, he feels this duty to fight for others, worried sick about his own siblings getting deported.
Yeah.
And he made this really sharp point, too, about families who claim they did it the right way. He suggested, often they actually came unlawfully first and only got legal status later because laws changed.
That's a perspective you don't often hear acknowledged.
Right. And he talked about the waiting times, like 20 plus years for some family petitions, 5 to 7 years just for an asylum hearing. He basically said, how can you wait that long when you're facing immediate danger? It makes the legal pathway seem impossible for many.
So the picture from the ground is just intense. Conflict, fear, resilience, all mixed together. But like you said, this deep dive isn't just about the here and now. This is where we connect it to the deeper stuff, prompted by your own concerns, your family, and that big question, what does it even mean to be Mexican?
Exactly. And that historical angle gets amplified, really, by your own experiences, right? Back in Crow Wing County, Minnesota, with law enforcement.
Yeah.
I mean, seeing your brother tackled, the skate shop raid, being harassed when you were homeless, facing false accusations, that gives you a very real, earned skepticism about official stories, doesn't it? You know how the reality on the ground can be so different from the report?
It definitely shapes how you hear these things.
And then you find out that Crow Wing County is one of just 3 in Minnesota with a 287G contract, which means local cops can basically act as ICE agents.
That's right.
And suddenly, those personal fears, that history, it connects directly to these bigger policies.
Yeah.
And you worry about families, like your dad's husbands, both there in Minnesota and folks they know near L.A.
It makes it very immediate.
Which leads us right into your question about what Mexican even signifies, and which indigenous groups kind of got folded into that label. It's a history that, let's just say, is often missing from the standard school books.
Yeah, you don't really learn this stuff.
And the key thing, the really crucial insight here, is that the very idea of Mexican was, in large part, a colonial label. It was imposed on this incredibly diverse landscape of indigenous peoples.
So before Mexico, there were just hundreds of different groups.
Hundreds. You had major civilizations like the Aztecs or Mexica, the Maya, Zapotec, Mixtec, Purépecha down south. And up north, closer to what's now the border, tribes like the Yaqui, Seri, Tohono O'odham, Kumeyaay. Their lands actually stretched across where the border is now. And California tribes, too, like the Chumash and the Tongva, right there in the L.A. area, all with their own languages, cultures, histories.
So very distinct.
Totally distinct. Then the Spanish arrive in 1519, and everything changes. They slap on this one label, Indian or Indio, basically erasing all that diversity on paper. And then came conquest. Disease estimates are like a 90% drop in indigenous populations by 1600. It was catastrophic.
Just devastating.
And they set up this whole racial caste system, mestizos for mixed Spanish and indigenous, Afro-Mexicans descended from enslaved Africans brought over, and so on. Mexican essentially became the term for anyone living in New Spain, this colonial territory. And the mission system, especially in California, was brutal in disrupting native lives and taking land.
So even after Mexico gets independence in 1821, that complexity is still kind of glossed over.
Often, yeah. The new national identity frequently centered on the mestizo culture, which tended to sideline or downplay the distinct indigenous groups and Afro-Mexican communities. But the really big shift for many people, especially in what's now the U.S. Southwest, came after 1848. the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo.
Right, when the U.S. took huge amounts of territory from Mexico.
Exactly, half of Mexico's territory. And just like that, overnight, thousands of indigenous and mestizo people living there became foreigners in their own homeland. They were supposed to get U.S. citizenship and rights, but often that didn't happen. They lost land, faced discrimination.
And the border itself just cut right through ancestral lands.
Right through. Tribes like the Tohono O'odham, the Kumeyaay, the Yaqui, their communities were literally split in two. And people just got labeled Mexican or Indian, depending on which side of the arbitrary line they ended up on, ignoring their actual tribal identity.
Wow.
And this erasure, this lumping people together, it isn't just ancient history. I mean, think about that awful LA City Council scandal back in 2022. You had council members using racist colonial-era terms to talk about indigenous Oaxacans. It shows how these attitudes persist.
But this history also fueled resistance movements, didn't it? Like the Chicano movement.
Absolutely. In the 1960s, the Chicano movement made a conscious effort to reclaim those indigenous roots. Concepts like Aztlan, the mythical Aztec homeland said to be in the U.S. Southwest, became really important. They were asserting, hey, we're indigenous to this land too.
Which ties right into that theme you're exploring for your paper, Mexicans were here first.
Exactly. It gives that idea deep historical roots. It's not just a slogan. It's grounded in centuries of presence and identity before these current nations existed.
So why don't we learn this history in school? It seems pretty fundamental.
Well, think about it. This history, it challenges the official stories, the national myths of both countries.
How so?
For the U.S., it complicates the whole nation of immigrants or melting pot story by pointing out that much of the land and labor was taken from people who were already here, indigenous people and later Mexicans. It forces an uncomfortable look at conquest and dispossession.
Okay.
And for Mexico, it challenges the narrative that sometimes glorifies mestizaje, the mixing, while often downplaying the ongoing struggles, discrimination, and, frankly, the attempted erasure of distinct indigenous cultures in Afro-Mexican history.
So it's like avoiding teaching the full story of the Plains Wars here, or the full impact of slavery. It protects certain narratives.
Exactly. It protects existing power structures. It helps maintain the status quo, including systems like white supremacy, by keeping the historical roots of inequality kind of hidden.
And that's the link, that historical dispossession, that erasure of identity. It connects to things like the ICE raids in LA today and the 287G program back in Minnesota.
That's the argument, yes, that these modern policies aren't happening in a vacuum. They could be seen as a continuation, in a way, of that long history of colonial control, border enforcement that disrupts communities, and systemic marginalization.
So it reframes current immigration enforcement as something much deeper, historically rooted.
Precisely. Part of a pattern of violence and control stretching back centuries.
Okay, let's shift perspective a bit now. Let's talk about how these protests, these events in LA, were actually perceived and presented. Because the sources suggest there wasn't just one view, right? Even within the communities affected.
No, definitely not. The street report itself notes some differing opinions on the tactics used during the protests.
Like what?
Well, some migrant workers, for example, folks interviewed near that Home Depot site, apparently didn't support what the report calls the more outlandish stuff, like direct action that involved vandalism or arson.
And you had business owners worried, too.
Yeah, concerned about property damage, understandably, feeling like maybe it hurt their own livelihoods, and also perhaps diluted the core message of the protest. Some felt, based on maybe past experiences like in 2020, that sustained presence, handing out pamphlets, holding signs that was more effective for building broad support.
And then there's this other argument presented, that the images of rioting actually helped the conservative side?
Right. The idea that focusing on looting or burning cars gave certain media outlets exactly what they needed to paint the whole progressive movement, the whole protest, in a negative light, to basically delegitimize their cause.
And the source even suggests maybe Trump's actions, like sending troops, were designed to provoke that, to create disaster bait for the news.
Yeah, it raises that possibility, that it was partly about controlling the narrative. The source mentions things like the White House putting out edited clips comparing peaceful scenes with chaotic ones, trying to shape public perception.
It really shows how powerful framing is.
But then you have a strong counter-perspective, especially, the source says, from some multi-generational LA folks referencing Chuco families.
And their view is different. They felt that kind of forceful action was needed.
Yeah. Their reasoning was, look, ICE keeps breaking up families, keeps causing this harm. So for them, this kind of direct, forceful protest is just how LA reacts. It's seen as a necessary fight back. The language used is really strong things like, until this city burns down and the war will know it. It shows this deep well of frustration and a feeling that maybe stronger tactics are the only way to be heard.
It really highlights the role of media, too, doesn't it? How different outlets frame the exact same event.
Oh, completely. The source points out the contrast in headlines about the Marine deployment. Left-leaning sources might call it a dramatic escalation, while right-leaning ones frame it as supporting the National Guard against anti-IC riots. Same event, totally different spin.
Yeah.
The source even mentions there are tools out there now to help people see that bias, track how different sources cover things, which is pretty useful.
And then there was that other idea mentioned. Maybe this whole focus on LA, the intensity, was partly performative, a distraction.
Yeah, that came up too. The suggestion that maybe Trump was using this whole situation to pull attention away from other things, like, say, a bill involving Medicaid cuts, or even that public spat he was having with Elon Musk at the time.
So questioning the motives behind the spotlight.
Right. Asking if the optics were serving some other political purpose beyond just immigration enforcement itself.
Okay, so we've got this really complex picture emerging, the immediate fight on the streets, the deep historical context, these clashing views on tactics and how it's all portrayed.
Yeah.
But running through all of this, there's also this clear spirit of resistance, isn't there? Of resilience. And that seems to connect with your own feelings, your desire to push back.
It's definitely there. You see it in the LA protests, and it's grounded in that history we talked about.
Yeah.
Like the Chicano movement reclaiming identity. It's not like this resistance came out of nowhere. It's part of a long, ongoing struggle.
And this connects right back to your idea for that paper, Mexicans were here first. How do the sources frame that kind of work?
They see it as a really powerful form of resistance in itself,
Yeah.
a way to challenge those dominant, often harmful narratives, to fight back against the hate and ignorance by asserting historical truth. It's about taking that frustration, that disgust with white supremacy you mentioned, and channeling it constructively, drawing strength from connecting with your dad's husband's heritage.
And your idea for that app, the Protect the People app, that also got mentioned.
Yeah, the sources noted it as a potential tool, something that could, possibly be relevant in situations like the one in LA, offering a way to support communities on the ground, maybe share information quickly.
So, okay, thinking about you personally in Minnesota, how does this spirit of action translate when you're not right there on the streets of LA? What kinds of steps came up?
Well, it really starts with education, right? Learning this complicated history, understanding the issues that are still playing out, and then sharing that knowledge with others. And supporting local groups. Finding organizations in Minnesota that work with Latino and indigenous communities, or groups that are specifically fighting those 287G contracts, like the one in Crow Wing County.
Makes sense. Using your own platform, too.
Yeah, whatever platform you have, amplifying the voices, the stories of people directly affected. But also being careful, verifying information, especially when there are so many competing narratives flying around.
Critical thinking is key.
Absolutely. And then there's the political advocacy piece. Contacting representatives about ICE policies, about things like Project 2025 that could dramatically change immigration enforcement.
And just personal support.
Definitely. Checking in on family, friends who might be impacted. Like you mentioned, checking on your dad's husband's family down in La Habra near LA.
Yeah.
That personal connection matters.
And finally, just challenging racism when you see it, right there in your own community.
Exactly. All these things, the writing, the learning about indigenous cultures, the local advocacy, challenging prejudice, they're all framed as ways to take that anger and frustration you feel and turn it into positive action to fight the hate you're tired of seeing.
It's about making a difference where you are.
Yeah, taking that energy and finding concrete ways to act, even from far away.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this deep dive up. We've covered a lot of ground. We started with that really intense, immediate conflict on the streets of LA, the ICE raids, the community pushing back, the heavy police response.
Right, and then we connected that right back to those deep historical roots. Centuries of indigenous history, the impact of colonialism, how borders were imposed, identities erased or lumped together. History that's often ignored, but is so crucial to understanding today.
Yeah, absolutely essential. We also looked at the different ways people saw the protests, the tactics used, how the media spun the events, and even that idea that maybe some of it was political theater.
And through it all, we saw that powerful spirit of resistance and resilience. We talk about how that connects to history and how it translates into action, including the kinds of steps you're thinking about taking yourself right there from Minnesota.
It really feels like understanding this whole situation means looking way beyond just the headlines. You have to connect the personal, your experiences, your family, to these big systemic issues.
And you had to be willing to hold all those different perspectives together, right?
Yeah,
The historical, the cultural, the political, and the deeply personal stories of the people living through it.
definitely.
So maybe here's a final thought for you to chew on. We heard about those incredibly long, difficult, sometimes seemingly impossible path to getting legal status. And we've talked of this profound history of displacement, of people being here long before the borders, long before the current legal systems even existed.
Yeah.
What does real justice even look like for those communities now, given that history? And maybe what responsibility does knowing this history place on all of us living on this land today?